Hello and welcome to the SportsPro podcast. I'm Sam Carp, the head of Editorial here at SportsPro, and you're about to hear an interview with Guido, the president of the San Francisco 49ers and chairman and chief executive of US-based sports marketing agency Elevate. Now on this occasion, Al was on to talk all about the business of stadium naming rights and more specifically, whether venue sponsorships are ever going to properly catch on here in Europe. We discussed the health of the global stadium naming rights marketplace today, some of the key differences between the European and North American market, and some of the misconceptions about the opportunity on both the buy and sell side. We also talked about Elevate's role in securing Hill Dickinson as the naming rights sponsor for Everton's new home, the nuances of selling the opportunity in Europe, and the all-important question about overcoming the skepticism of fans. As you can tell, there was plenty to get into, so I won't keep you waiting any longer. Here's Guido. Guido, president of the San Francisco 49ers and chairman and chief executive of Elevate. Welcome to the SportsPro podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Sam. It's a real pleasure.
Yeah, how are you doing? I said welcome, but really I should have said welcome back because I'm sure you've been on the SportsPro podcast before with some of my colleagues, and on stage at SportsPro events, you've definitely racked up a few caps there, I think. So welcome back probably been a little bit more fitting.
Well, I'm a big fan of SportsPro, and so everything that you guys do, it's good to be back on.
Great stuff. Well, yeah, let's get into it. It's actually quite a unique time in the year to be talking to you because at the time of recording, new NFL season has just got underway. 49ers got off to a winning start against the Seattle Seahawks. I'm sure that was a good news to you after the build up. Before we get into it, what's this time of year like for you as president of that organization?
It's exciting. It's busy, of course. I mean, the 49ers season is always it's really, it's anticipation all summer long, leading up to it, the work that gets put in. And then on top of that, Sam, is, I'm sure we're going to get into it, but we're also hosting the Super Bowl and the World Cup. I know it's quote unquote next year, but it's February. So it's this year's Super Bowl 60. And so there's just a lot of planning and preparation that goes into it. It's a really busy time.
Yeah, for sure. And a big part of that business, or I suppose a growing part of that business as well with Elevate, is sponsorship, sales representation, and increasingly, you're being entrusted by sports organizations to sell stadium naming rights, not just in the US, but globally. It seems to be an increasing opportunity, which we're going to kind of get into today on the back of some of one particular recent deal that you guys helped secure here in the UK, which a few of our listeners, I'm sure, will be able to guess which one I'm talking about. But I mean, you probably have quite a unique perspective in that you obviously sort of, you sit a little bit on the sell side with the 49ers already, and then also in that sort of in-between space with Elevate, which I guess is also kind of straddles that sell side as well. But how do you kind of view the general health of the stadium naming rights landscape today, and sort of how are you sort of seeing it evolve?
Oh, it's very healthy. I mean, as you sort of led into, we were proud to represent Everton and Hill Dickinson Stadium. And Sam, I think it's not just naming rights, but in general, if you think about the power of live sports, I don't know that it's ever been a better time. And certainly there are tailwinds and headwinds depending upon what sport you may be in. But I think about global football, the Premiership, the visibility, not just in stadia, but frankly, online, on TV, it's just never been better, right? And the truth of the matter is, if you look at the media that's being spent and the dollars that are being spent against these broadcast rights, you can sort of think about, like, if it's so valuable to those media companies because of those eyeballs, it's no different than a sponsor or a brand that wants to, put their name on it. And Sam, the big thing about naming rights, different than frankly any other team related sponsor, is you are picking up the TV visible aspect of it. Your name and your impressions are just picking up so much, they're so much greater than any other partnership. And, in my home base of the San Francisco 49ers, we have Levi's, the jeans company, that took on the naming rights partner. They're globally, they're located here from a headquarters spec, but obviously they're global in brand. And I think the CEO, Chip Berg, former CEO Chip Berg, went on record after Super Bowl 50, literally just 2 years in to the deal, and said just from an impressions value, right, that they had already gotten their ROI on that investment just because of the sheer nature of NFL football games and the ratings they get. And I think as the world shrinks, Sam, meaning as all of these sports grow in their global aspirations, not only are they followed in their home countries, but they're followed all around the world. and that the social and digital footprint of these fan bases have just continued to grow. Brands are trying to latch onto that in meaningful ways. And so if you look at the last, call it, 5-ish years, and a lot of it's around new stadium infrastructure. Give our friends down in LA a lot of credit with SoFi, and look what Anthony Noto's done with that naming rights and what it's meant to SoFi's business. I like to think that Hill Dickinson, it was really cool watching the first game there and seeing it. I was in the US watching it on NBC and Peacock, right? And having how many times it was named in the broadcast and how many times of aerial shots of that building came up. And so I like to believe that it is truly the greatest asset in sports sponsorship. And we're only going to see it grow, not just in value, but in the number of teams and or stadiums that want to put a naming rights partner on their building.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess the what was so unique about the Everton deal, what was so, I suppose, quite impressive about the Everton deal is that they succeeded where a lot of clubs in this market in particular have failed. You mentioned where you are in San Francisco in North America specifically, a very mature market for stadium naming rights. Very few venues in the major leagues that don't have a naming right sponsor attached to them. And then, the market that I'm in, the UK, Europe, a little bit more broadly, that's not necessarily the case. There's various theories as to why that might be, and I could tell you a little story. So I follow Crystal Palace, and so I was a member about 10, 15 years ago now, maybe more. Some pictures of signage outside Selhurst Park somehow emerged on social media, on Twitter, of the 1-2-bet stadium, and people are obviously kind of drawing their own conclusions as to what that might mean, whether a kind of naming rights deal had been secured and something was about to be announced, and it kind of naturally, sparked quite a bit of outrage because Selhurst Park has never had a naming rights sponsor attached to it, and we never kind of heard anything about it again. So there was kind of, lots of people obviously thought it was sort of a plant to gauge what the reaction might be. But I suppose that kind of speaks to one of the reasons that it's been a bit more of a challenge for naming rights deals to catch on here in Europe. I mean, what's your take on that? Why do you think it is that you know we haven't seen that sort of maturation here over in Europe compared to the States?
I think you nailed it. I mean, I generally think, just from a feeling and a passion and a pride and authorship, it's harder when you're talking about stadiums that are the age of your stadiums, right? It's not as if they haven't gone through renovations, but some of them have been around a lot longer, and there's fans identify with how the stadium is called today, right? I mean, obviously in Everton, Goodison was like, you never would have thought about calling it anything but Goodison, right? And so, but when you build something new, it does give you a chance to kind of restart. So I think it's hard, and I don't. It's fascinating, Sam. I talked to a lot of teams and CEOs, both in the UK and Europe, and they like to believe it's a little bit different. But I'll sort of point you to, two, right, in the States, Lambeau Field,
Yeah,
right, does not it's not a, and then Arrowhead Stadium now has kind of Giha at Arrowhead Stadium. I mean, Mile High Stadium in the Denver Broncos, Yankee Stadium, right? And so this is not a new thing, in my opinion. It is hard at times, and sponsors do have a hard time, because when something is called X Stadium for so long, and then you put a brand name on it, sponsors are always going to wonder, one, the pushback from the supporters, and
mm,
two, will it ever really be called,
yeah,
what
yeah.
they're actually paying to sponsor it? And so the reality is, it is definitely easier when you're starting anew, because you have a clean slate. The one thing I think that we'll see over time, Sam, but my general sense here is that financial fair play and a lot of the things that are happening within the ecosystem of the sport, we've always known that these sports are commercialized. They are for-profit entities.
Mm,
And now that there's so much stigma around how much revenue a club can generate, and then vis-a-vis put that back onto the pitch. My sense is, if the story and the narrative is correct from the club to the supporters to the brand, you can sort of, you can thread that needle. But it has to be thread very carefully, because you don't want to do it in a way that kind of, makes the supporters angry. And I think this is where Hill Dickinson made a lot of sense. This is where Levi Stadium made a lot of sense, because you had a local brand, right, that also was a global, institution, but most of the people view them as local supporters, right? And so when I think about the Hill Dickinson conversation, the Levi Stadium conversation, it's the story arc that matters, right? If you think about Levi Strauss, I mean, it literally was the jeans people wore during the gold rush, right?
Yeah.
And so it was so synonymous with everything about the Bay Area that when you put that name on the stadium, it just fit. The jeans were literally the jeans the mascot wore before they were even our naming rights partner, right? And so I
Hmm.
think this is the job of the agency and the club is to find a brand and pardon the fun that fits right the narrative of the club that the supporters will back, and that is not an easy needle to thread, but it is doable.
Yeah, I was about to say that. How easy is it to do that? Because you think of, I'm sure if people had to take a wild guess at who the Everton naming rights sponsor was going to be at the start of the process, I'm not sure many people would have landed on Hill Dickinson. I imagine there were quite a lot of layers that the team had to unpick to, find a commercial law firm with that kind some of those unique ties that you mentioned.
Yep.
What's kind of the strategy there then in terms of how you go about identifying the right partner who ticks those boxes? I suppose who has those community ties, but can also kind of, match the global appeal of a Premier League football club, for example.
Yeah, I think if you look at most stadium name rights deals, and I mean this around the globe, most of them the businesses that sponsor the stadiums have a local presence. It might not be the headquarters, it might be the second office or location, but they do really have a local presence, right? Because they need to activate in that market for it to make sense for them. There's very few, and there are some that are just global brands that don't have offices that are just looking for media value of those teams. And that's understandable given the size and nature of some of these clubs. And so I think first you're trying to find someone that has a connection to the club as best you possibly can. Second, you're looking for a global scale because the truth of the matter is these are expensive propositions. And to obviously pay for this expensive proposition, you got to probably be a global brand, right? They themselves need to understand activation within the club and what it means to be a naming rights partner. And so all of that stuff goes into it, Sam. Then there's areas that the club might care about. And might be some of the areas that people have tripped up in the past, or whether it's, hey, what value are we looking for? And something you need to be aligned with your owner around what is the true value of a naming rights partner. You might need to decide what trade-offs you're willing to take. Some companies that might be larger in their services or their products might take up more categories than you might want, right? And so I might think about it as like, let's use Levi's as an example. I'm certainly thrilled at the dollars that Levi's pays us, and I'm very appreciative of it. It also helps that from a team perspective that they're a jeans company. They
Uh,
don't compete with anyone else, right? And so I think as you think about from just the club's perspective, and I'm sure you have a lot of listeners here who are on the business side, it really truly is about sort of what is that proper fit from the right brand in the local market that has global appeal, that has activation knowledge around how they're going to bring their brand to market. And then how does that set you up across your other sponsorship portfolio to where you can make sure that your marketing mix, we call it your asset architecture or your asset mix, makes
mm.
sense for your commercial stack?
Yeah, it's interesting as well because I want to go back to something that you said before about naming rights being the kind of most powerful asset, and your conversation with your partner at Levi's about how they'd already sort of realized the ROI on the media value alone. Um, I think one of the things that I sometimes find or wonder about the European market in particular is whether there's sometimes a little bit of a misunderstanding about the naming rights opportunity. And you sort of alluded to it a little bit there in terms of, the asset stack and like the various benefits that come with a naming rights deal. There's obviously is that kind of exposure element and the media value that you mentioned, but there's also a lot beyond that, right? A lot of companies that do the stadium naming rights deals tend to use it to build things like trust. They do it as a hosting opportunity, all those various other elements that we have. And then also, I wonder if in the European market, there's a little bit of a misunderstanding around, well, some brands maybe balk at the idea of making such a long term commitment. The idea of a 10-year deal, a 10-year sponsorship deal in Europe is a little bit more alien than it is maybe in the US, where brands see that as a long term investment and know that they're going to get the value out of it. What are kind of, I suppose, some of the yeah, on that note, what are sort of some of the most, common misunderstandings or misconceptions you see maybe, both on the buy and the sell side? Because I imagine there's some rights holders who approach selling naming rights in the same way that they'd maybe try to sell a shirt sponsorship, for example, and do focus on that media value alone when there are so many different benefits beyond that.
Yeah, I think I mean, you nailed it. From a brand perspective, most of the brands you talk to already truly understand like the level of naming rights. You don't take Brands don't take a meeting about naming rights without having, at least a good enough knowledge around what it means. Now, the IP, you mentioned this, Sam, the IP that goes into that deal. Of course, there's the media exposure within the stadium. There's hospitality assets because they're local and they want to take guests and customers to it. There's the social and digital platforms that it lives on. There's the LEDs and all the other things, right? So there is a marketing mix or an IP mix that goes into that. You were spot on. You mentioned in your question. I think the one challenge we see in the European market different than American market is the term length.
Mm,
Um, we're used to seeing jerseys are so valuable in so many different ways because they travel with the brand, right? You can argue naming rights partners have the 20-ish or 30-ish matches in the stadium on those days, right? And the reality is it's valuable because it's on TV on those. The jersey, which is what brands have obviously valued in that market. One, it's easier in global nature because you're really on the front. You're picked up in retail. You're traveled everywhere. Every social and digital um, uh, clip you put on, whether it's Instagram or TikTok or you name it, right, of your players carries your media impression of your jersey. And so I think in the States where before we had jersey patches, because we didn't have them until the NBA decided really to do them. I guess maybe the MLS first, right? But naming rights was always at the top of that food chain from a brand sponsor perspective. So if you sell in the
mm,
States, it's like I start with naming rights, I go to the next thing. Now it's interesting with the jersey patches, it's not the same as it is for, Europeans, right? Where it's more prominent. You can see it in the NBA. It's more of a patch than it is actually a jersey, right? And so it's funny in the way that Europeans are so used to getting pitched jersey sponsorships and they're used to it, right? And they understand that IP where naming rights are sort of like, okay, well, how am I getting the level of exposure that I need to get to, knowing that I only might spend, might have 30 matches. The other part of it, Sam, is the duration of the game,
mm,
right? That you, in and of itself, the game is, quote unquote, right, 90 minutes plus or minus the pre-post that might happen within the time frame in which it gets covered. Where
yeah.
in American football, you're talking about a 4-hour experience on television, right? So it's just very different in that regard. And so once you educate the buyer on the value proposition, it does then get to the trade-offs of the ownership group, which is like, what is the dollars that you're willing to take? Understanding that naming rights is just different.
Mm,
Two, the brand, how comfortable are you in signing up for a 10-year deal? You know this, Sam. I mean, a lot of the conversation, especially if you're not in the top tier, gets into the relegation. How do you negotiate that, right? What does that look like? I mean, Everton obviously was really close a couple years and
mm,
when they went through that ownership transfer. And so how do you talk to Hill Dickinson around what the relegation risk is, how the value proposition may change? I mean, that is just unique to certain brands. Now, Hill Dickinson not unique too because they understand they're fans of the club. But if it's an American brand that has quote unquote global headquarters, the CMO may or may not really understand how to value that risk profile,
mm.
right? And
Yep.
so I think those are some of the unique aspects that just frankly don't happen in America.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose how do you sort of overcome some of those things then if you do that's probably the golden question, right? Is that's the thing that you're trying to prove to those brands all the time is sort of making sure that they can see the value irrespective of where that team is, and to like make it that's probably where those other benefits come into it, right? Beyond the kind of media value question and sort of using it as an asset for other purposes and some of those other objectives that I mentioned around around B2B opportunities and positioning it as a community asset and potentially even the multi-purpose element that we're increasingly seeing with some venues as well.
Well, you just nailed it. I think you have to unpack each one, right?
Mm,
And whether you consider them objections or whether you consider them just good, qualifying questions. First is the sheer amount of events, and you nailed it. All right. I think that the new stadia, um, and give Tottenham a lot of credit. I know there's been a lot of discussion around the value proposition, but they have put in a lot of events. And prior to that, Wembley, right? I mean, the amount of events that get put into Wembley Stadium is just different than some other Premier League stadiums, right? And so, and you know this, Sam, that also gets to a conversation with the club because we know how religious the pitch is in
Yeah.
Europe and certainly the UK, right? And the inability or the thought that like you would never put anything but football on the pitch, right? And so, but with new technology, with the things that we're seeing, you saw probably what Real Madrid is doing within their pitch and how they might be thinking about it. I give, global football a lot of credit. I at Levi Stadium put in, call it, I'll geek out on your podcast listeners, like the sub air system. We can keep natural grass and pitches available and very, very good while also still having other events. Technology has come a long way.
Mm.
And so I think first and foremost in Everton, the value proposition was not that you were just buying a Premier League football team. It was that you were buying a 365-day platform, right? That there was going to be hundreds of private events that get held inside the hospitality spaces. There may be a couple concerts. They may be international or American football that may get played. And so how the ownership group thinks about how they activate the stadium is just very different. Now it's easier to do in a newer venue versus an older venue, just given operations. And
Mm.
so that's what makes these newer renovations and or large renovations really sort of start the conversation with brands around what's possible. As far as it relates to like the relegation, all those things, it's really just part of the negotiation. I mean, it's no different than Jersey Patch. The reality is there's a value for a Premier League team given the visibility, and there's a value for a championship team. And
Mm.
that's just true. And so I think you just go into those conversations honestly and knowingly and figure out what your risk mitigation is. What I will say, Sam, I would say the benefit of the longer term nature of it is for some of the larger clubs is you're going to see some yo-yoing in their performance on the relative pitch. I mean, the Premier League is hardest, most competitive, arguably league in the world, right? And so, yeah, you'd love to believe that you can aspire to or always be in the top 3 or 4. But the truth of the matter is it's tough, right? And so your partner knows that and they want to go on that journey and that ride with you. And so, if you're on a 10-year or 20-year deal, it's not going to be the value is not going to be derived by any one season in that, right? Or any 2 seasons in that deal. And so I just think in my heart of hearts, once a brand understands, hey, I'm here for the long run. I'm financially stable. I'm building a global platform and a business. I understand that there's performance risk on the pitch. Sometimes that nobody can control. You might have injuries, you might have other issues. And then it's really up to the club to make sure that they're delivering on that value proposition in a way that's meaningful to the brand. And so you just got to unclick all of those or double click on all of those questions. And I do think the more that folks like Hill Dickinson or others who have naming rights start to talk about the value that they see in that naming rights, other brands will latch on to that and also decide to do it in the future.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting as well because you guys have obviously just secured a similar brief that you had with Everton for Valencia as well for the new Mestalla, which yeah, two very passionate fan bases there. Brave, what agency would take those on now? But yeah, brave ones to go for. But yeah, I mean, in terms of that, is there hope, I guess, for those that not every club's going to have a new stadium in the next sort of decade. But I guess at the same time, what we're also seeing is kind of maybe, I don't know if this is the right phrase, but almost the Americanization of the fan experience over in this country, where we are actually seeing clubs recognize now that it is important to, keep your fans at venue for longer than those 90 minutes, revolutionize the kind of the pre and post game offering. And they're also looking at what we were speaking about before, bringing more events into the venue, whether that is kind of more entertainment, more music. Does that kind of the fact that you're kind of opening yourself up to a different audience there beyond that core, I suppose, football or whatever sport it might be, that is the chief tenant, is that kind of another opportunity there that potentially lends itself to maybe a naming rights deal further down the line?
Yes, and so I'll start with the Valencia piece, and I'll get. We actually encourage, or we look forward to working with clubs that have what I would call outsized fandom. the reality is, right, and passionate fan bases is because without that, there are no supporters. There are no naming rights partners that would be interested. And so we lean into that. Like that is the beauty of sports, right? When Elevate looks to service a client or maybe looks to make an investment in something, the outsized fandom, like the fact that it is, quote unquote, religious, or it is like what you build your calendar around. That is good for all of us in the sports world. We want that. We should lean into it.
Mm.
As far as, and the one thing I find it funny, Sam, on the Americanization, because it gets talked about a lot, and supporters or fans of teams might push back on it. And let me just kind of debunk this theory for a second. I actually don't believe any of this is the Americanization of sport. I If you look at what Barcelona does within their museum and their tour business and their real estate, right? American clubs are trying to pattern that. If you look at what, give Manchester United or others in the commercial form of what they did on the sponsorship side around how they sell LEDs or their global patch. And then the Premier League, right? You could be watching and seeing one LED sponsor in one country, you can see it in another. That does not exist in American football, in the NFL, right? And now you see the NFL is trying to play games internationally and open up global markets. And so what I would say, Sam, is like as an agency, we're trying to take the best commercialization from all parts of the world. There are definitely areas, and like there is a cultural element, don't get me wrong, that is unique in these markets. But what I would say is like, again, they're all for profit entities. Their job is to win games on the pitch or the diamond or the ice or the court or the field, whatever you want to call it. And the more revenue they can generate, the better the fan experience can be, the more sponsors that feel authentic to the club that people can rally around is only good for the success of the actual franchise. And so, sure, is there push pull? Don't get me wrong, right? I grew up a fan. I sat in upper decks of stadiums because that's all I can afford of a ticket to get in. 20 years ago, I took in my first Premier League game. I walked up to Manchester City and I bought a ticket. I sat in the upper deck. I had a bunch of pints. I had a ton of fun. And I understood that, yes, you're right. The two experiences are not the same. But what quickly became clear to me is that fandom is fandom. It's not American fandom. It's not UK fandom. It's not Spain fandom or Italy fandom. It is fandom.
Mhm.
And every media company, every agency, even the ones I compete with, are doing really, really well because fans are demanding more content from their teams.
Mm.
I saw a stat the other day, Sam. The media buying business, right, around sports and entertainment is a $90 billion TAM. The Amazons, the Apples, the Googles via YouTube are not just spending on sports media because they want to, right? It's because that's where the eyeballs are.
Yeah,
And if you're a brand and you're trying to capture eyeballs, or to your point, grow a B2B market, or gain trust in what your services may or may not be, let me ask you, or your listeners, where else do you put your money? There's no other place that you're capturing the power of live. I have three daughters, 16, 14, and 12. I promise you, I don't know the last television show they watched live.
yeah,
The only thing I know that they watch live is sports. And so if you believe that that's where we're headed, is in an on-demand society, that sports is the one thing that you cannot script. It is the power of live. And I'm a brand that wants to capture that passion and attention. There's no other place to do it.
for sure. I almost feel like we could end the podcast there, Al, because that was stirring. But I've still got a few more questions. But
It's okay.
I wanted to come back because we've obviously spoken about the Everton deal, and one stadium that you've mentioned a couple of times is Spurs and Tottenham, and because they tick a lot of the boxes that we've spoken about, right? In terms of multi-purpose, they've hosted a ton of high-profile concerts at that venue: Taylor Swift, Beyonce. The fan experience is really good. They get people to that ground 2 hours beforehand because the the yeah, the experience in the concourse is great. You know, you mentioned the pints before. They pour good pints at that ground, self-pouring pints in some cases. So what you know, why have they struggled? Do you think, for example, in the way that an Everton hasn't? I suppose with Everton, you know, one of the good things about that deal is that you guys got it done a few months before they played the first game in the venue, and it's fairly well known, I suppose, that once the ball's kicked in a football stadium and people start calling it one name, it's increasingly hard to make them call it another, which is maybe part of the challenge for Spurs. But you know, what from your perspective do you think would have been the challenge there? I suppose.
Yeah, Sam, it's hard to say because I'm not in those walls.
Mm,
And I have a lot of respect for what they did. I think you're right. And the challenge now is it is being called something else. And games have been played in the stadium and events have occurred. And so to put it's
mm,
always much harder to place a name on a stadium after it's opened. A couple have done it. It's always harder to change a naming rights. Whether something that's why term is so important, because if I'm a partner, one, I want the long term because I want to create that IP. If I'm a team, it's really hard to sell because I look down the street at the San Francisco Giants, who were once AT&T Park for so long,
mm,
right? And still I see people on the streets that may still call it that. Now, give Oracle credit, or it's Oracle Park now, but changing naming rights is difficult no matter where you are. And whether it's a donor name like we see in the university space in America, where it's college stadiums are named after donor names and then they want to go to a brand, if it's Tottenham. And so I think that is a challenge. Sam, I do think that, in fairness to Tottenham, they were trying to change, from what I gather, they were trying to change a value proposition market around how naming rights was valued versus other assets. And that's always hard to do when you're trying to reset a market. Um, I had the pleasure of working for the Dallas Cowboys when we reset the market as it relates to what your fans or listeners might call debentures, right?
mm.
What we might call PSLs. When you're trying to reset a market, it's always very difficult. And so I don't know where they stand. Elevate never represented Tottenham. I know the few agencies have taken a crack at it. Um, but my general sense is it's going to be hard now that it's been, the current name for so long.
Sure. And I just wanted to ask from a kind of category perspective as well, because historically we've seen, you know, financial services, insurance, be, you know, very reliable and for a reliable category to call upon for rights holders when it comes to stadium naming rights. I guess airlines as well. There's a few that we could rattle off. But how do you kind of see that evolving? And do you maybe see that different in Europe as well? Do you think, you know, there's some of the stats that you rattled off before about the eyeballs on sport and it being, you know, the only place really that people are tuning into for live. Um, we've sort of seen obviously Amazon do it a little bit with Climate Pledge Arena in Seattle. But do you think we're sort of maybe going to see a bit of an evolution and see some of those really, maybe the tech giants get involved a little bit more and maybe a little bit of a diversification of the categories that we see investing in these opportunities?
Yeah, hard to say. I would imagine. I think that the tech giants will be very selective in, they are looking for marquee assets that are differentiated. I do think, Sam, the one challenge, and certainly in the UK and broader Europe, is also the footprint. Um,
Mm,
we in you mentioned it, in America, it's just more spread out, right? I mean, it's unfathomable to Americans that two rival teams will be 2 miles apart, right? Or 4 miles apart, right? Like, it's unfathomable that that's the case. Like, we have to fly on a 2-hour flight to get to our rival, right? That's just not the way it works in the rest of the world. And so, with that territory, um, you might see like a JP Morgan Chase. Think about the America's very different, right? JP Morgan Chase has multiple different naming rights in America, but they're in a very different regions and segments and the demographics in which they hit, which is some of the challenge in the UK, right? Is just a proximity load. Right? We all know, of course, the London-based teams, right? Is like how you think about that. So I do think you'll see more non-traditional um, companies do naming rights deals, because the wow factor, like, right,
mm,
for a company that, I don't want to call them challenger brands because you need to have the financial wherewithal to be able to do this. but I do think you'll see the non-traditional categories start to take some of this on, or ones, we'll see what the AI boom might mean for spending over time, right? In America, certainly, and I'm sure across the globe, like you see, it's not just call it, the Mag Sevens or others. There are a lot of different AI companies that are coming online here. There'll be multiple winners that come out of this. If you look at, I know crypto in and of itself went through a difficult time, but still crypto arena. You got Coinbase who's spending a lot of money, and so I don't know what the next category is, Sam. I do think that you're still going to see financial services and technology probably lead the food chain.
Yeah.
Some of that is because of not just their financial wherewithal, but their global footprint allows them to activate their customer base in all of those regions. And so, and that's also some of the challenge, right? Some of the challenge in these companies there, or they might be American headquarters, and so educating them on a global fandom or footprint might be very, very different. And so we'll see. Like we did the first deal with a French-based company in Ledger with the San Antonio Spurs. A lot of that was because of what Ledger's aspirations were in the US. Some of that because of Wembanyama, right, on the court. And so that's what I mean is I do think that the world is shrinking, meaning fans are becoming fans across the globe. And so my hope is that there's more um there's more inside of each one of those categories. Like I look at what SoFi, what when SoFi did that deal,
Yeah.
if you ask them now, it doesn't shock anybody given their footprint. But when they actually signed that deal, it shocked the world, right?
Mhm.
And then you think about what Chime has spent and other companies. And now you have this IPO, like IPOs are coming back. Klarna just happened the other day, right? And so there is this world where some of these in the financial category can be split a number of different ways. It's not just the quote unquote big banks. There
Yeah.
are these tech-ish financial companies or fintech companies that
Mm.
might be looking to maybe make a splash here and there.
Yeah, sure. I guess Revolut, maybe another one. I wrote about them quite recently, and they seem to be spending a fair bit in sponsorship at the moment. So yeah, maybe they're one of the
That's
next
right.
ones to go into
Yeah,
it.
I
But
mean, look at Sports Illustrated, right? I mean,
mm,
Sports Illustrated just did a naming rights deal in Red Bull, right?
yeah,
With Red Bull Arena, and if you actually rewind the tape 24 months ago, they were not a naming rights person you would have called, right? Most
mm,
people would have viewed them as an old magazine. Now they're a fantastic, good ticketing company today who's trying to build their ticketing company brand, right? And they've built a very good technology from what I've gathered. And so in my opinion, I think you see these big companies backed by these big institutions, whether private equity or such, that are trying to attract eyeballs in the sports space and stand out in a significant way. And the good news is there's ample opportunities for them to do it.
sure. And just before I let you go, Al, going back to I suppose Europe specifically, it feels like we're at a point now where rights holders are perhaps, exploring this opportunity more and more. It feels like maybe fan attitudes are maybe softening a little bit. You alluded to it earlier in terms you alluded to FFP, and I feel like fans are increasingly kind of aware of the importance of, sponsorship deals and how their impact on performance on the pitch, basically. Whereas, I think in the past they wouldn't have thought so much about that, but they're a lot more conscious of that now, and perhaps would be a little bit more receptive if they knew that the revenue coming from a naming rights deal was going towards the next player they were bringing on transfer. But so how do you kind of see this evolving? And I suppose over the next decade, are you expecting we're going to see kind of an increase in volume in Europe in particular?
I do. I do. I think you're going to see a lot of infrastructure projects, happen, whether it's stand expansion, right? Because the truth of the matter is they do need to generate revenue. These buildings are also older. Their use of life needs to be changed. And so with that comes new opportunities. Sam, I think when I talk to my seat, and this is the beauty of running a team, right? I know what it feels like to sit in the seat of an operator, right? And a president of a club that does that absolutely, like, we are here because of our fans. I think fans in today's world, like, they really respect and understand transparency, right? When you tell them the reasons why you're doing that, um, they get it. They really do get it. They don't have to love it all, but they get it. And you have to meet every fan where they are. I think the challenge of any operator, any club, is to make sure that you have a price for every fan. And so they may care about the sponsor, they may or may not, right? Hopefully they do. And hospitality is even changing. We mentioned Tottenham and how they changed what hospitality looked like in that market. Now, what Everton's done in hospitality looks very different when you go to an Everton game today at Hill Dickinson Stadium. The actual seating product looks very different than a lot of clubs in the UK. And so, but there's also the supporter sections, there's the supporter stands, right? There's things in which every team, and that's why I say I don't really think this is a UK or European thing. I honestly think this is just more broadly sports, is that there are fans from every socioeconomic background, right? From different parts of the world. All of us have built global fan bases, and we need to meet our fans where they are.
Mhm.
Sometimes that's brands, sometimes that's the fan themselves, the consumer. And so what I tell everybody is when they look at their infrastructure and they look at their pricing and their commercial stack, there is there is a spot for every fan. And if there's not, then the team's got to do a better job.
Sure. Well, Al, always a pleasure chatting to you. We really appreciate your time, and yeah, all the best with the rest of this NFL season, and hopefully we'll get you back on soon.
Thanks, Sam. I really appreciate it. Very kind of you guys.